going? My name is Kevin Burke. I work on the API team at Twilio. For those of you that don't know, Twilio offers an API that lets you make calls and send text messages really easily. If any of you want to quit Rails and start working on a legacy PHP and Python code base, come talk to me during the happy hour after the talk. So we think a lot about documentation because if users can't figure out how to get started with our product, they can't pay us money. So we need to make sure that our documentation is doing good things. It's working the way users expect. I also personally do a lot of work with new users, users that are new to Twilio and new to programming in general. So that sort of fuels some of the stuff we'll be talking about today. All right, what we'll be talking about, we're going to talk about why people don't read your documentation. We're going to try to develop a theory for how users go through your product, how they sort of go through, how they experience errors, how they solve those problems that they run into. We'll also talk about some tips for making your documentation more usable. We'll talk about some tips in general for working around this problem, that people not reading your documentation. We're not going to talk about motivating you to write documentation. This is a journey you'll have to go on your own. You should write some. You should write documentation. We're also not going to talk about, there's a lot of evidence that if you design a simpler interface, you will reduce the support load, your product will be more intuitive, et cetera, et cetera. That's just outside the scope of this talk, but is also a useful skill. This is also not a talk about people that are actually illiterate, as fascinating as that would be to learn about. It's just more about general browsing on the internet than it is about illiterate users. All right, so once upon a time, people wrote documentation that nobody read. How do I know that people wrote documentation that nobody read, that nobody's reading your documentation? Because nobody reads anything on the internet. So it's safe to say that once your concept has made it into the onion, it sort of jumped the shark, and it's something that you need to be thinking about when you're writing content for the web. So the sort of definitive resource here is an article by a usability researcher named Jacob Nielsen. He wrote this article called How Users Read on the Web. The conclusion of the article is that users don't actually read, they scan, right? If they can't find the answers they're looking for when they're scanning your content, they just leave, right? They go and find another resource. They try to find some other place that has an answer to their question. This article was written in 1997. It's more relevant than ever today, especially when people have mobile devices, they have notifications, they're getting notifications all the time. For content, they're increasingly distracted. I'd encourage you to take a look at this. It's excellent. We're going to cover some of the basics of this today. So this is an example that Nielsen did. This is an eye tracking study, so they put these sophisticated devices that measure where your eyes look on the page. In this case, they just ask users to solve a simple task, right? Find some information, and then watch their eyes as they do it, right? And you can see there's an F-shaped pattern here. Users start looking in the top left. They scan across to the right-hand side of the page. Maybe if you're lucky, they scan across one more time. Then it's generally straight down the left-hand side of the page, looking for information relevant to their topic. So you'll notice here one of the key things is that even within one block of content, like a headline, the amount of fixations, the amount of attention from the user varies. So like the left-hand side of stuff is generally more important than the right, even within a single document. So yeah, so what do readers actually look at? You can browse through this list here. It's also useful to think about what users aren't looking at. They're not looking at big blocks of paragraphs, right? If you have two ideas in a paragraph, it's safe to assume that the user is not even going to see that second idea. Instead, split it out, add a new line, break it up into a new paragraph, right? Users are also not looking at anything that looks like marketing copy, anything that looks like an ad, for example. So if you have a call to action that's embedded in an image, it's safe to say that your user's probably missing it, right? You don't have a lot of attention. You don't have a lot of room for error on the web. This is another example from Nielsen. This is actually from the article How Users Read on the Web, where they gave users a sample piece of text that was formatted in two different ways. They split up the users into two groups. Then they quizzed them on it later. This is an article about state parks in Nebraska. So they said, how many state parks are there in Nebraska? What are the names of the state parks, et cetera, et cetera? Then measured the retention, right? Like how much did users actually remember when the text was formatted in these different ways. Can anyone guess which version did better, the left version or the right, the content? The left, right? The left version did better. It's safe to say it's pretty easy. Can anyone guess how much better the version on the left was in terms of performance, users' performance on the content, like in a percentage? Like 3 times as much? 90%? 70%? So it turns out it's actually 125% as good, the left version. That's like 2.25x improvement of the version on the left and the version on the right. They're doing 3 specific things. The version on the left, it's shorter, right? So they took out the 2 sentences at the beginning have a lot of fluff content. They really condensed that down into a shorter version. They also made the text more objective. It turns out that phrases like draw crowds without fail turn off users, right? They sound like marketing copy. They sound like not answers to my question. So users tend to not pay attention to words like that. They also made it scannable, right? So we can browse right down the left-hand side, see the beginning of every name that's there, begins with a bullet point. It's pretty easy to see all of the content right there. So let's look at some examples. I pulled some examples from around the web, just of documentation that observes and fails to observe these sorts of principles. My apologies if any of your documentation comes up during this talk. Okay, so let's dig right in here. So this is an example of GitHub README. They're using the README without a file extension or readme.txt format. And the problem here is that fixed width text tends to be very difficult to scan at a glance, right? All of the letters are exactly the same width. The line heights are almost similar for the lowercase and uppercase letters. The headlines are the same size as the body content. It makes it more difficult to scan and read what's going on, right? Instead, use the default markdown format. Use the advantages of HTML as it's given to you, right? Use bold, use links, use headings, separate out that content, right? So if you're writing for GitHub, if that's your primary entry point into your documentation, use the default markdown format, right? Use what's presented to you in that case. This is actually from Twilio's documentation. I mentioned earlier that users tend to ignore things that look like ads. Is there anything on this page that looks like it could be an ad? The stuff in red, right? It's a giant banner. It spans the entire page. It looks like content that you might want to ignore. The irony here is that this is actually the content that we wanted to call out the most, right? It's in red. It's a banner. But I've seen multiple times in user testing, people just tend to ignore that section. An improvement here might be just using a red exclamation point icon, maybe some bold and red text, just as warning, hey, you should probably pay attention to this, and kill the red background on the banner. This is another example. So this is primarily okay, except that the lines are just too long, right? If you think about readers as browsing down the left-hand side of your content, if the line is too long, there's just a lot of text that they're missing on the right-hand side. It's just too far for the reader to browse across, see all the content. It's too easy for them to miss content that's there. It's too hard to parse the line when it's this long. Just because you have this much space in the browser doesn't mean you need to use all of it, right? Add generous margins to your content, and people will be happy. So this is an example from GitHub. I like this for a few reasons. One is that they're breaking up the content often, right? If the paragraphs are short, they're breaking up the content with code samples. They're using headings, they're using bold, they're using links. These are all very nice things that make this pleasing to read when you're getting started. The other reason I like this is because they're embedding structure into the document by adding step numbers to the headings. So let's say I was scanning through this document for an answer to my question. I scanned all the way straight down to step 4, typed something into my terminal, and it stopped working. That's a cue for me that maybe I should go back and read step 1, step 2, et cetera, before I attempt step 4. Here's another example. This is from Heroku. I like this because they put the table of contents right at the top. So this is where you are likely, as a user, to pay the most attention. They've put the most important information to get you as far as they can into the document right there at the top of the page. They could do a little bit of work on their information sent, this idea that we want to put the most important words at the beginning. So for example, here they have this phrase, store your app in Git, right? The important word there is Git. That's what I would key on. Similarly with the word gem file, with the word proc file, these are the words that I would be keying on as a user. We should put those at the beginning of the line, right? For example, use Git to track revisions in your application. Makes it much easier for someone scanning down the left-hand side to see that's the content that they want to look at. Another usability principle is that users are really bad at searching for content. The irony here is that as Google gets better and better, users' faith in trust in Google grows, and the problem is that if Google doesn't return an answer to their query, they tend to think that the answer does not exist, right? Where a simple modification to the query might return the answer that they're looking for, right? Instead, users tend to be very stubborn, persist with a query, and then say, well, if the answer isn't on the page, then it must not exist, right? No one must have an answer to my question. So here's a quote from Jeff Atwood. He's one of the founders of Stack Overflow. This is talking about duplicates. You might have had the experience of asking a question on Stack Overflow, which is a question and answer site, and having the answer be rejected as a duplicate. A while ago, they had an epiphany and said, well, maybe the answer is the same answer for a few different types of question, but if users are using different words to search for the content, then we want to have a different answer for each type of user, right? We want to be able for the user to match on the question type and make sense of it that way. In a podcast they mentioned they shoot for about 4 different versions of popular questions. That tends to be the number of different ways people search for the same information on that page. An example of this from our own website at Twilio is we use this word called helper libraries. This phrase to describe we have these library bindings in PHP and Python and Ruby that sort of wrap our HTTP API and give you nice objects that you can use to sort of script Twilio. But I've seen it referred to as all of these different words. And so what we need to think about as content producers is if a user is searching using this word to try to find the library name, are they going to be able to find it? Are they going to be able to find what they're looking for? Are they going to make it to our site? What we've ended up doing to get around this is referring to the languages specifically, right? Using the words Ruby, Python, PHP, because it tends that people searching for those words can know and click to go right to the spot where they want to go to. So what is the implication of failure in this case? How will it manifest itself? You may get additional support queries. If your documentation is confusing, people can't find the answers they're looking for, they're going to ask you, right? That's an increased cost for you, right? If you're a big company, you need to hire someone to answer all these questions. If you're an open source developer, this is super annoying because you probably have a day job and you don't want to spend time away from your kids, et cetera, answering questions on the internet. It's also expensive, right? Imagine I signed up for a service, I tried to get started with it, and then I couldn't, right? I walk out the door, that's money out the door for you. So that's not a great solution either for you. It's also frustrating for users, right? As a user, if I can't find the answer I'm looking for, I get very frustrated, right? This is why I post angry tweets on the internet and consider quitting the software industry, right? Is when stuff like this happens. So it's frustrating on both ends when users can't find answers to their questions. So why does this happen? Let's try to develop a model for the sort of disconnect between writers and readers. This is a guy named Clay Christensen. He's a professor at Harvard Business School. He's a very smart guy. He has this theory he talks about a lot called jobs to be done. Bear with me if you've heard this before, but the idea here is that traditionally when we're marketing a product, you think about, we have this product, now who should we sell it to, right? What groups would be interested in this? So then you pick a demographic like single moms, ages 25 to 49, or Ruby developers on the West Coast, and then you go and target the product and say, hey, single moms, I think you'd be interested in this, check it out. Christensen advises flipping this on its head. So instead of starting with a product and then finding people who might be interested in it, let's see how people are using this, right? Let's see what needs this is fulfilling in someone's life. And then target our product, position our product to make sense for them. So as an example, he gives milkshakes. So there was a fast food company that wanted to improve the sales of its milkshakes. So instead of targeting this to, let's go sell this to teens, let's go sell this to whoever, they said, why do people drink milkshakes? And the answers came out in 2 different ways. When commuters bought milkshakes, they wanted a thicker milkshake. They wanted something to keep them busy during the commute. They could drink it with one hand. It would put off their hunger for just a little bit. They like little bits of fruit in the milkshake, et cetera, right? But when parents bought milkshakes for their kids, they wanted a less thick milkshake, right? They didn't want a thick milkshake. Otherwise, their kid would be sitting there trying to drink this milkshake for 30 minutes, and they're late for soccer practice and all that sort of thing. So it's the same product, right, a milkshake, but by looking at it by who's using it and what their sort of needs are, it ends up with two different implications for a very similar sounding thing. So let's apply the same theory to our documentation. Generally, when we're writing documentation, we maybe just finished version 1 of our product. We have full knowledge of the product in our head. It solves our use case. That's why we wrote it. And we're sitting down to write this full documentation. We're starting at the top, writing all the way through. Compare that to the reader, right? The reader is trying to fulfill a need in their life. They're browsing maybe 10 different things. They're considering different options. There's a disconnect there between the way that we write documentation and the way that we're reading it, right? Instead of writing documentation as, we've got this product, let's see who might be interested in it, flip that on its head and say, how would people use this? What need is this fulfilling in people's lives? How is this going to help people? So let's take a look at this. So as an example of a job to be done, a significant portion of numbers at Twilio, the way people use numbers at Twilio, is just a forward to their cell phone, right? They purchase a number from us, they forward it to their cell phone. I spoke with a guy recently who runs a pedicab company in 4 different cities in the US, and all he wanted was just a local number so that people could call, a 415 number in San Francisco, and it would forward to his cell phone. He could then dispatch a driver to pick them up. He wasn't very technical, right? He just wanted a solution to this problem. This is what he was using Twilio for. And if you looked at our documentation at the time, say how to do everything with an incoming call, here's what the Twilio HTTP request will look like. Here's what your response should look like in XML format. Here's how to do a voicemail. Here's how to do conference calls. Here's how to queue people. We didn't really have a solution for this very easy use case that could potentially make us a lot of money, right? By thinking about this, by putting links in our documentation to say, hey, if you're not technical, here are some things you can do that are pretty easy, right? Here are some tools we offer to make this really easy for you. This is something you can think about as you're writing documentation. Here's another example. This is also from Twilio. This is a first page of a quick start. This page is actually a complete failure. So if you look at it, the person who is writing this is the first page of 6. They're sitting down and imagining a reader as someone who would start at the first page, go on to the next page, go on to the next page, go on to the next page. When it turns out, readers don't do this at all, right? They're looking for specific answers to their questions. Heaven forbid that the answer to their question is on page 4 of this quick start. No one ever gets there, right? We also have this very, very small call to action down here at the bottom. A lot of people miss this when they're going through the quick start. They either start browsing the content on the left-hand side, going back to Google looking for a different answer to their question. So this is an example of how, as a writer, we wrote documentation that really wasn't fulfilling a reader's need. We weren't thinking about how readers were using the content. An improvement here would just be to make this one page, right? Put the entire quick start on one page, make it easy for a reader to browse through and scan the entire document looking for the information they wanted. Another thing is that you should assume that readers are not reading any of the context surrounding your code snippets. You should assume that all of your code snippets, someone is just going to take that, copy and paste it, and try to run it in a terminal or in a command line. We've seen this multiple times. So here's an example code snippet that we had on our site. That was also a failure. So let's take a look. There are actually 3 ways that this is going to fail. The first one is assumes you've set environment variables in your environment, right? If you create this REST client without any parameters, it's going to try to read stuff out of your environment. A Twilio account it in an auth token, and then do stuff with it. This will fail silently if you don't have those environment variables set. It works great when you're running on Heroku, when you're just getting started with the product. It's a complete failure, right? We also have this typo in SMS messages. I see this often enough that it's worth pointing out. It's very confusing for users because they copy and paste this off your website, expect it to work, and then it completely breaks. It's a problem. I've seen it all the time. Just make sure that your documentation and code samples are free of these sorts of typos. Finally, we've forgotten the require line at the top of the file that's going to require the library. If a user was going to copy and paste this, they'd get an uninitialized constant error when they're trying to run the sample. So a simple code snippet, right? It was going to fail in 3 specific ways. It's going to generate a lot of frustration for your users, a lot of frustration when you're going through this. Here's the betterment. It's cut off a little bit on the right-hand side, but the idea is it's not much more work, right? It's just 3 lines. This will actually work when you copy-paste it into the browser. We've also put the context right there. This is where you can get the Twilio Ruby library. We also have more information at the link about how to use the library, some sample actions, how it handles errors, that sort of thing. This is another example I thought I'd point out because I see it often enough. People copying and pasting. If we try to run this in a terminal, I've seen people copy and paste this. The first thing they get is this. They try to run this with a $, and then the $sign obviously isn't a command, so it just fails. I don't have great ideas here because there's also a convention that if a line doesn't begin with a $, then it's output from a command, or it's something you're supposed to copy and paste and put in a text editor. It's just something to look out for, especially when you've got new users on the command line. This is a big problem.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep. Go for it. What's up?
So where does the $sign convention come from?
So it's usually the beginning of a terminal prompt, like a naked terminal prompt that you get when you start with a terminal. It's generally the left-hand side. So that's like, the idea is that it's the beginning, right? Sometimes you see a pound is supposed to be the root user, right, on the left-hand side of the. Right. So yeah, so anyway, just something to think about when you're writing documentation is that I've seen this problem happen more or less every week at Twilio. So how can you find out what your users are trying to do? How can you find out what phrases they're thinking of, what their mental model is? The short answer is they're going to tell you, right? You can look at your support questions. You can look at your forums and say, what questions are users asking, right? How are they phrasing their questions? What are they trying to do, right? They'll start with a question that says, I'm trying to do X, Y, and Z. Well, think about that, right? That's an example use case that your documentation can solve. Here, this is Google Analytics. I've just set up a very simple filter that says, everyone that lands on our documentation, what search queries did they use that got us to this page? What were they actually searching for that landed them on our documentation, right? What words were they using? There are two specific things that came out of this. First one is we saw people were using languages very often, right? So they were searching for PHP SMS, so they were searching for Ruby call, right? How do I do this in a specific language? So what we did is we put the languages right inside the documentation so that people could see the code samples right there, right? They didn't want to know necessarily about the raw HTTP reference. Instead it was, how am I actually going to be sending this message? What code am I actually going to be typing into my browser to make this work? Second one was we saw that people were using verbs, right? People were saying PHP schedule call, right? Or PHP send SMS, right? They're using these verbs to search for things. So the betterment here was we put, on the homepage, we put a list of verbs, right? A list of actions that you can take. Just trying to match people scanning this, right? And looking for actions to take. They'd hopefully key on one of these and go off to the right page. If you do actually look at this on our homepage, a lot of these links go to the same pages. We're just trying to match on whatever the user is trying to do, right? And send them to the right place based on that. Okay. So we can think about this, right? If we think about our users, right? If we try to develop a model, the user going through our product, right? Or trying to get something done. We can think about it as a user has a goal. They have something they're trying to do. And then they fail, right? And then they go off in the wilderness and look for help. And then figure out how to solve the problem or quit the software industry entirely. And then come back, right? And continue along the path, right? Similar to like games, right? You go and you die a few times and then you get better and end up defeating the boss at the end of the level. Thinking about Clay Christensen theory, every time a user fails, they're looking for a need, right? They're looking for something to help fill that void. They're looking for something to help them get through that problem, right? If you're writing documentation or you're evaluating a product, you should be there, right? You should be there to help your user. Your resources should win, right, when your users are looking for help. Your documentation should be the first thing that's on their mind. Let's look at some examples of this. So this is an example error that our users were getting a lot when they tried to run the Ruby quick start, right? So some of you might know what this means. Let's all pretend that we had no idea what this means. We were trying to write some code in the command line, hit enter, and then this happened, right? So what would you do? If you got this error message, what would you do, right? If you got this? Google it, right? You'd punch this into Google. Okay, so let's say we copy and paste this. We add in some words that are specific to us, like Twilio and Ruby, and we search for it on Google, right? Here's what we get. The first result is from Stack Overflow. The second result, also from Stack Overflow. The third result is a Twilio forum post from 2011. May have an answer, may not. May have an answer that's up to date. This is unclear, right? The third answer is a third-party Twilio library. It's not an official Twilio library. It's also a GitHub issue. Again, may have an answer to the question, may not. May have an up-to-date answer to the question. Unclear. The fifth post is from a blog post explaining how to get started on Heroku. also from 2011, right? So the problem is that our documentation is not here, right? We've completely failed for the user who's trying to find an answer to this question. We're not even in the user's mind here. We're nowhere to be found, right? We're not providing an answer. We're not helping the user. There's an obvious betterment here, which is if users get an error message a lot, put that exact text in your documentation. For us, about 45% of our users, I checked over the weekend, are coming straight from Google, right? On an average day, this means that 45% of people browsing to our documentation are coming directly from Google to our docs, right? And if our documentation is not matching this query, then our users are missing out, right? They're not going to find our documentation. They're going to go off to a third-party page, and we've lost control over that experience. We've lost control over the experience the user has getting started with their product. Here are some examples of failures. So this is a company I pulled off the internet. They put their documentation behind a login wall, right? So you have to sign in or register to see this. The implication is that Google can't find their documentation, can't index their documentation. So this essentially means to the 45% of hits might be going to this documentation, right? Even though their users are, might have login credentials, when they run into problems and search for them on Google, the answers they find are not going to be available on this company's website, right? They've essentially blocked off all of that traffic that's coming from Google, redirected them to third-party sites, right? There might be a legitimate business reason to restrict access to your API, but your documentation should at least be indexable by Google. Otherwise, you're leading users down a crazy path into third-party user space. Here's another example, PDFs, right? So click here to download our API documentation as a PDF. This is not a good experience for two reasons. Number one is Google tends to not index PDFs as well as it does actual HTML. It's super annoying to scan through this as a user and scan through PDFs, right? Searching doesn't work as well PDF as it does in the browser. Finally, it's harder to regenerate PDFs than it is like a CMS or a web page, right? You got to find the guy that has the magic PDF building incantation or Adobe, whatever, and get him to rebuild the docs and put it up on the website. This page is also a mess. You can see there's a huge block of text going across and a lot of marketing content on this page. So the betterment here is, put your documentation in HTML, put it in a website. This is a great example. This is from Google Closure. So if you use Google Closure, they're like JavaScript framework, and you get an error, they've put this error reference page up. It's got both the tokens that you'd find, right, in the error page, as well as the actual human readable text of the error message right there on the page. So if I got a shift amount out of bounds error when I was using Google Closure, I type it into Google, I get straight to this page that explains, what went wrong and how to fix it. I can go back and fix the problem, and then I'm back as a happy developer, right? This is a great experience when you're using Google. If they can't figure out how to solve your problem, at least they've got this documentation page here that's ready to help you out. So this is a company called WikiHow, right? I like to just point out that Google search traffic is pretty valuable, and if you're not thinking about it, then other companies will. So these are some guys that noticed that people were searching for Twilio-related phrases a lot. They put out this simple page about how to validate requests from Twilio. This is not a great experience for our users, right? We don't want our users to go to this ad-filled page that might be up to date, it might not, right? The good news is that if you have scannable content, indexable content, you're generally going to win, right? Hopefully you have a domain that's pretty high in SEO for your own company name, right? So your documentation should win, but this is just something to keep in mind that if you're not on Google, other companies may be, and they may be getting this traffic that's not great for your user experience. Okay, so we've put this error message in our documentation. That's great, right? A user gets a failure, they search for it, find the answer, go back to programming, great. Why not go further, right? Why not see if we can nip this even further, develop a faster feedback loop? So here's this error again. Does anyone know actually why this is caused? Why a user might run into this? Invalid SSL certificate, right. So a user has an old server that doesn't have an up-to-date CA cert list. They try to make a request to api.twilio.com. It doesn't match with the certificates they have on the computer, and then the certificate fails and the request fails, right? Not a great experience for the user. So what we ended up doing is we ended up just shipping our own certificate list with the library. So the library now is going to use our own certificate to validate requests instead of the random, whatever certificate happens to be on the server, right? We've obviated the need for documentation in this case. We've just eliminated the problem for the user. This is a much better experience for the user than having to go through that feedback loop. Here's another example. This is from RVM. This is the RVM installation process. This is a great experience because the command line is a pretty scary place, especially for new users. It's hard to get started. The error messages are very obtuse. It takes a while to figure out, if you guys remember the early days of learning how to program on the command line. So what the RVM people said is, we're tired of dealing with installation problems. We're tired of dealing with misconfigured statuses, so let's just make our own install script, right? Let's install it. What we can do then is we can customize the error messages that come out. We can take care of things like making sure it's installed in the right place, making sure we have permissions, et cetera, before we get started here. There is a security problem here where it's not particularly great to have users trusting random scripts that they download off the internet and running them on their computer. I don't have enough time to get into it. Suffice to say that like programming on the command line is difficult enough for new users that I'd recommend doing this. It's like a poor man's PKG or DMG installer. So yeah, so this is a way to get around that problem. Another thing we can do is add documentation to our validation, right? If you think about causes of user failure, a lot of it is sending bad input to your API, sending bad input to your interfaces, et cetera, right? John Dahl touched on this a little bit earlier today. We can document how to fix the errors right there in our documentation. So this is an example from a product we have called hurl.it. Just lets you make HTTP requests in the browser, view the responses right there on the page. So if you send it a bad URL to go fetch, we'll say, that's wait what, right? Which is not a very clear error message. Doesn't explain what actually went wrong, right? If I read this, it could be a server error. It could be any number of different things, right? It's not clear what actually failed in this case. This error message doesn't instruct the user how to solve the problem at all. It's pretty frustrating. So what's the betterment here? Instead of saying, that's wait what, let's say if the URL was bad, let's explain that the URL was bad. If you didn't include a URL, let's say please include a URL. If the URL was malformed for whatever reason, let's say the URL was invalid, right? Let's also put the URL, whatever the user gave us, right back into the string. This is valuable in places like where you have an API. Let's say you're accepting input from a user and then sending it to an API. You might not even see the data, right? You might just be a transparent pass-through. So if you get back a message that just says the URL is invalid, you're not going to know which URL it was that was invalid. You're not even going to know what the user input was. By putting that error message there, it makes it more likely that your error catching is going to detect the problem and be able to fix it on the client side. But we can do even better than this. A lot of times when I see URL validation, people leave off the scheme at the front, right? So people type in google.com, they leave out the HTTP at the front, and then this fails validation, right? This is particularly confusing because Google and Firefox and other browsers will accept these URLs without a scheme on the front, right? So in this case, we can say the URL was invalid, but if it was valid with a scheme at the front, we can say, did you mean HTTP? And this is a way to help the user see this is what you need to do to fix the problem, get back on the happy path. So is this amount of effort worth it, right? We've turned about 3 lines of validation into 9 or 10. Is that worth it? To me, it is, right? If you think about the amount of work that your team is doing in marketing and sales to get people in the door, the amount of money that you're spending and effort to do that, to lose them later on down the line, if they're, they've gotten past the point of sign up, they've gotten to the point of writing code to actually use your service. To get discouraged or frustrated at this point is pretty expensive for you. To have a bad experience of your product, it's very expensive, right? It's a lot of wasted effort on your part to spend all that money getting them in the door and see them walk back out the other side. So that's great. So we've looked at common errors in our documentation. We've seen what people are doing to search for our content. The next step is you actually want to watch people use your service. So this doesn't need to be anything fancy. You don't need a lab. You don't need sophisticated equipment. You don't need to pay a company $100 to go out and find users for you to test on. All you need is just to go out and just ask someone, hey, I'd like to take 30 minutes of your time. I'm trying to work on my product. I'm trying to see what failures people will have in it. Could you help me out for a second, right? We usually give out a t-shirt and some amount of free credit in our service. It's pretty simple, right? To start with, just ask the simplest possible thing people can do with your product or with your open source tool. Say, do the simplest possible thing. For us, this is try to send an SMS to your phone, right? It takes about 30 minutes. After you've asked the question, be silent and get out of the way, right? It'll be very tempting to scream at the user and say, how could you get this wrong? Just scroll down the page a little bit further. You'll see the answer to your question. But I encourage you not to do that. Just stay out of the way, or you'll never see how frustrating it is for you to use your own product, right? And you'll gain a lot of insight into how people think about things, people's typical paths through your site, through starting up, just by doing this. And it's pretty cheap. It's pretty cheap to get started. I definitely recommend this to you as sort of the next step in your journey. All right, so almost out of time here. Let's talk a little bit about takeaways from today's session. The first is making your documentation more readable, right? We talked a lot about usability principles, how people read on the internet, how they scan on the internet, how to write your documentation in a way that makes sense. Use the tools that HTML gives you for formatting content, right? Use the headings, use bold, use links, use italics. Break up your paragraphs, right? One idea per paragraph, break it up, use code samples, right? Use all these different tools to help you out. The paragraphs, the first 3 to 5 words of your paragraph should have a strong information sent. They should explain exactly what the content is doing. If you're curious about this, go read BBC News' headlines. They're always 3 to 5 words. They're all excellent, right? They explain exactly what the article is doing. They're great models for you as you're writing documentation. Finally, 65 to 90 characters per line tends to be a good guideline, right? That's about 3 fixations of your eye, your user's eye, as they're scanning across the page. It's just funny that 80 character line limits started as a technical limitation of punch cards, but it actually tended to be a good readability limitation as well for how often you should be breaking up the page and adding new lines into your content. Second, you should care about SEO. You should care about this because your users are using Google a lot. It's not that hard to get started. I encourage you to read the Google SEO guide. It's a good guide to get started. Your URL should describe the content. The heading should describe the content, et cetera. Finally, every page is a landing page, right? You might expect users to browse your content starting at the root and going hierarchically down into your service. That's not actually true. They can land on any page. It should make sense inside the grander scheme of your documentation. Finally, thinking about jobs to be done, right? Every failure for the user is a potential job to be done. It's a potential fix for your users. This is something you should think about. You should think about, is my product, have I designed this around users' needs? Have I made this make sense for my users? Look at this, right? So you should be able to control most user failures, right? Control that experience that happens, right? Even though it's on the command line, it's outside of your website, you should be able to control what users see, be able to help them and steer them through that process of using your site. The good news is, as a documentation writer, even if you're not technical, error messages tend to be a great place to get started with a product. Because you can search for them, you can fix them and change them without understanding really anything about the surrounding code base, right? And open source developers tend to like these changes, make error messages more clear. It's a great way to get started with a new project, or even within your company, right? If you're a product manager or a salesperson, getting started with the code base and trying to help improve things. The error messages are a great place to start. Finally, if you have a chance, just fix the problem for the user. Don't even let them run into it. Fix it before it starts is another thing that you can do to improve your documentation, right? It's just obviate the need to document anything at all is a great place to fix that. That's all the time I have. I'd like to say thanks very much. You've been a great audience. I know there's like happy hours and stuff around the way, so I appreciate you guys being here. The slides are available online, and I'm happy to take any of your questions. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Have a great night.